Okay, this is the first of two videos about the Great Depression and the New Deal. So you should have printed out the notes that are attached to this lesson, and you should be ready to fill them out. Just like for the Roaring Twenties, part of the notes are an answer key at the end. So if I'm going too fast, or if it's easier for you later to fill in the notes and just listen to the video, that is absolutely fine. The PowerPoint I'm using will also be attached to the lesson. So for future reference, you could have the PowerPoint and all the things that I talked about today. So we started the Roaring Twenties. It was a fantastic decade. Everything was looking great. There was prosperity, there was money, there was pleasure, there was entertainment. And now, unfortunately, we're going to talk about the 1930s. And it's called the Great Depression for a reason. As I'm looking at these materials and getting ready to teach them to you, they are depressing. Some really terrible things started happening during the Great Depression, and we're going to learn about that in this video. So the first slide that we're going to look at is just a little description. What was the Great Depression? So first of all, it says when it occurred. So in your notes, you are filling in the dates that the Great Depression occurred. It occurred between 1929 and 1941. And during this time, the economy, that goes in your blank, was at an all-time low, not only in the United States, but worldwide. We were having a depression in the United States. The rest of the world was also having a depression. The economy, you probably heard that word a lot before, is the system of how people make money, how money is used, and how money is spent. And then the fourth thing on here says a region's economy is connected with things like how many goods and services are produced and how much money people can spend on these things. Now, as I'm looking at these materials, I see some similarities to what is happening right now during our pandemic. It's not a Great Depression, but we are seeing some similar things. Right now, many people do not have jobs, and many people are struggling to survive because they're not getting paid at all. And they're having to get some help from the government just to make it. Now, fortunately, as things get better, the country's going to open back up and the economy will pick up. People will be able to get back to their jobs. People will be able to go out to restaurants, to stores. We'll be able to start spending money again, and the economy will pick up again. It's not going to be a Great Depression that lasted over 10 years, but some of the things that are happening are kind of similar, and you, I think, will be able to understand a little bit more about what's happening in the Great Depression just because of what we're seeing happening right now all over the world and in the United States. Because right now, the economy in Maryland is suffering. It's suffering because so many businesses had to shut down because they weren't essential businesses. So it's kind of like a snowball effect. The businesses have to shut down because they're not essential. All of the people that work in those businesses who are not essential workers now do not have jobs anymore. So therefore, all of those people who used the money that they made to go out and buy their groceries and gasoline and clothing and all of the things that we buy, they can't buy anything. So now, even the businesses that are still running, the essential businesses, are not making the kind of money they did before. And that's why the government has been giving us stimulus money. Stimulus is to stimulate the economy. Stimulate means to get the economy working again, to help people have a little money in their pocket to spend in the economy, to get things started again. So, as we're studying the Great Depression, we're going to be able to understand some of the things that are happening to these people and to be thankful that for us, this is not going to be a 10-year process and the 10 years of a horrible depression. Okay, the next slide that we're looking at is what caused the Great Depression. So, the Great Depression didn't happen because of one event. So, in your notes, you're going to write the Great Depression in that blank. It wasn't just one event. Some people say the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. Well, it was one thing that was part of the Great Depression, and it was kind of the beginning of the Great Depression. But it wasn't the only thing that caused the Great Depression. So in that second blank, you're going to fill in the stock market crash of 1929. Other things joined in to make the Great Depression. So, overproduction. Companies made too much, and people didn't buy it. A drought. We learned about this in science, when there is not enough rain for a long period of time. Too much debt. We learned about that in the Roaring '20s. People have a bunch of credit and a bunch of debt. It's a big problem. The failing bank system. Remember, we talked about that. The banks didn't have money. They had invested in the stock market, and now the people that had bank loans couldn't pay them back because they didn't have any money. And there was a lack of world trade because there was a depression all over the world. And so this caused the terrible economic status during this time. So your blanks are other factors such as overproduction, making too much of something and having a bunch left over. Like when you go to the store and you see the clearance aisle, that's all the stuff that they either made too much of or people didn't want, and now they're making it really cheap just because they want to sell. Drought, not enough rain, too much debt, the bank failing, lack of world trade. All of these things contributed to the Great Depression. I'm going to show you a video now that gives you an overview with some pictures and some visuals just to help of what caused the Great Depression.
The causes of the Great Depression. The 1930s saw a prolonged period of economic difficulties known as the Great Depression. What caused the Great Depression? Could it have been prevented? In the 1920s, the United States was becoming the world's leading economic nation. The European nations had been devastated by World War I, and America was prospering. The introduction of electricity to American homes had revolutionized day-to-day life. Electric washing machines, vacuum cleaners, irons, radios, and refrigerators were all in high demand. Increased advertising on the radio and in magazines only strengthened this desire for new devices. Advertisers were stressing to the American people that they just might be the last family on the block to have the latest, greatest product. Americans found themselves needing items that, just a few years before, did not even exist. Unfortunately for consumers, many of these items were far too expensive for the average person to buy. A family might have to save for years to purchase a washing machine or an automobile. This led to the development of installment buying, or buying on credit. A consumer would purchase an item by making a small down payment and pay off the rest in monthly installments. This allowed families to own items that they could only dream of otherwise. Consumers weren't the only ones buying on installment. This same method of purchasing was being used in the stock market. Investors would purchase stocks from a broker, paying as little as 10% of the stock's price. As long as the stock price continued to rise, they could pay off the balance with little difficulty. The stock itself would serve as collateral, meaning if the stock price fell, they would lose the stock and still have to pay off the loan. This method of purchasing was known as buying on margin. In the 1920s, more and more people were turning to the stock market as a method of making fast income. By 1929, it was estimated that about 4 million Americans were invested in the stock market. Many of these inexperienced investors were also engaging in speculation. This meant they were gambling financially with high-risk stocks. If the stocks became successful, it meant quick profits. However, speculating on stocks combined with buying those stocks on margin, could mean financial doom for investors if the stock market took a turn for the worse. That is exactly what happened in the fall of 1929. In the last week of October, the stock market began to fail. Nervous investors began to sell their stocks rapidly, which intensified the problem. On October 29, 1929, the stock market collapsed. This day is remembered as Black Tuesday. Banks were crippled by the stock market crash. In all, 641 banks closed by the end of 1929. More than 5,000 would close in the next several years. Many banks might have survived, but with so many closing, Americans panicked. They rushed to their own bank to withdraw their money, fearing it was about to shut down. This is known as a run on the bank. With no money to operate with, the bank was forced out of business. This cycle of disaster only continued. Once consumerism slowed, salespeople were laid off. Many who worked in manufacturing also lost their jobs or had their hours and pay severely cut. As the Depression deepened, millions of these employees were laid off. With no income, the average citizen could no longer afford to repay the debts they had incurred through buying on installment. Since no one was repaying their debts, this crippled even more businesses and financial institutions. The end result was millions more losing their jobs.
Okay, that video, like I said, this is the Great Depression, so the videos are depressing. One thing that really struck me about that video was seeing all of the people going to the bank at the same time, trying to take out their money. And so that it was called the run on the banks. Banks ran out of money. They had no money to do business with, and that's why a lot of the banks closed. So that video gave you a little bit more information about what caused the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, soup kitchens came into being. During the Great Depression, many people lost their jobs, lost all their money. They were hungry. They were homeless. They had no food. So people went to soup kitchens, places where they stood in extremely long lines and waited a long time just to get something to eat. Now, in America today, we have things called food pantries and food banks. And during this pandemic, many people have been going to food pantries and food banks to get food because they're experiencing the same thing. They don't have the money to buy the food right now. So if people are able, they are donating food so that people that don't have jobs can have something to eat. It was kind of like that during the Great Depression. The soup kitchens opened and they fed many people. These are just two pictures. One is a line outside of a food kitchen, soup kitchen, just to give you an idea. And then there's a picture of the inside of a soup kitchen with the long benches and the people eating. All right, the next slide is about the Dust Bowl. And I think I did the same thing I did before in the last video. Forgot to get you to write the notes for the soup kitchen. Like Mrs. Harshall gets so excited about going to the next slide that she forgets. So, for soup kitchens, number 8 in your notes, top of the second page. During this time, many people had lost their jobs, and most or all of their money. They were homeless and hungry. People would stand in extremely long lines at soup kitchens to get something to eat. Like the pictures that I showed you and the pictures in the video. And those were some pictures we just talked about. Okay, now back to the Dust Bowl. So we learned in some of our other history units about how the settlers moved to the Midwest and how they grew all of this different kind of grain and wheat, and how turkey red wheat became very popular because it could grow all year long. And this region became known as America's breadbasket. And it produced food for most of the people in America? Well, just like the stock market and people losing their jobs in businesses, disaster hit the farmland in the Midwest at the same time. This was called the Dust Bowl. There was a drought, and we learned in science a drought is not enough rain for a long period of time. So, because of the drought, the soil turned into dust, and it was very, very dry. And then the winds would cause very large dust storms. Many families lost their farms, lost everything. Because if you're a farmer, you don't have any soil, you don't have any crops. So they had to migrate to other places to try to find work. Now I'm going to show you a video about the Dust Bowl. Remember, it's the Great Depression, so the video is depressing. But it does give you a good idea of what is going on. It's really, really a rough time for many Americans.
Let me tell you how it was. I don't care who describes that to you. Nobody can tell it any worse than what it was. And no one exaggerates that. There is no way for it to be exaggerated. It was that bad.
It was just unbelievable. It'd blister your face. It would put your eyes out. Well, I guess I can't describe it. It was just constant, just that steady blow of dirt.
As far as you could see, there was a dust storm coming right towards you. This giant wall just coming towards you. And you still had the feeling, whether you would admit it, that something was going to run over you and just crush you.
It was almost surreal. The dust. There's nowhere you can run. You can try to get out of it, but it's as if it follows you, follows you, follows you. You can't escape it. Looking back on it, I think it carried with it a feeling of, I don't know the word exactly, of, well, being unreal, but almost being evil.
It was a decade-long natural catastrophe of biblical proportions, when the skies refused their rains, when plagues of grasshoppers and swarms of rabbits descended on parched fields, when bewildered families huddled in darkened rooms while angry winds shook their homes. Pillars of dust choked out the midday sun, and the land itself, the soil they had depended upon for their survival and counted on for their prosperity, turned against them with a lethal vengeance. It was the worst man-made ecological disaster in American history, when the irresistible promise of easy money and the heedless actions of thousands of farmers, encouraged by their government, resulted in a collective tragedy that nearly swept away the breadbasket of the nation.
It's a classic tale of human beings pushing too hard against nature and nature pushing back. And then it's an American bubble story too, like stocks and like real estate. We think that everything that goes up will not come down, that we can defy gravity, and that's what we did here.
The Dust Bowl belongs on the list of the top 3, 4, 5 environmental catastrophes in world history. But those catastrophes took place over hundreds and even thousands of years of deforestation. We've created a world-class environmental disaster in a matter of 40 or 50 years.
It was an epic of human pain and suffering, when normally self-reliant fathers found themselves unable to provide for their families, when even the most vigilant mothers were unable to stop the dirt that invaded their houses from killing their children. When thousands of desperate Americans were torn from their homes and forced on the road in an exodus unlike anything the United States has ever seen. But it is also the story of heroic perseverance, of a resilient people who somehow managed to endure one unimaginable hardship after another, to hold on to their lives, their land, and the ones they loved.
What kind of place was this where children couldn't go outside? Where the air itself could kill you? Where the sky showered down this suffocating blackness that could erase the sun at midday? Who could do that? And we didn't plan this. We didn't set out and say, let's ruin the second greatest ecosystem in North America. It was a result of a whole bunch of things that are just innate to human beings.
Okay, like I said, the Great Depression is depressing. So the Dust Bowl was in the Midwest, in the farmland. And as the video alludes to, farmers had been using the land irresponsibly and not being wise about how they planted their crops. And that was part of the problem. A part of the problem was also the drought. So this was also happening along with the stock market crash and the unemployment. We had the Dust Bowl. When you saw those pictures, just try to imagine you see a huge cloud of dust that blocks out the sun in the middle of the day. I mean, it is completely hard for me to imagine living through that. And all of these families had to just pick up and leave with nothing, literally nothing. Everything was destroyed. So these people were very courageous, and they did survive this. But it was a very difficult time in history. The next slide, oh, hold on. I think I forgot to get you to write the notes for the Dust Bowl, Mrs. Harshaw. So let's take the notes for the Dust Bowl. All right, in the Midwest, farmers struggled to keep their farms functioning due to a large drought. The soil had been turned to dust. Many farmers lost their farms and migrated to California in search of work. Remember, these farmers have no way to support their families now. To find jobs somewhere, so they head out to California to try to find another job. Okay, now, President Herbert Hoover, he was the president when the Great Depression began. And many people, because he was the president at this time, they blamed him for the Great Depression. They said the entire Great Depression was his fault. Now, this was not true. There were many things that happened that he had no control over and he had no part in. Because he was the president and he didn't do anything to fix the problem, people blamed him. So unfortunately, many people became homeless during the Great Depression. And they built towns, like shanty towns, which are just towns with little wooden houses. And to show how much they hated President Hoover and blamed him, they named their towns Hoovervilles, just to show him what they thought. Here is a picture of a Hooverville. And you can see they are very tiny dwellings. They're like shacks. They're barely anything. They had no electricity. They had no running water. They had no sanitation. We've talked about this when we talked about history in the past. No sanitation means no bathroom, which means when you are going to the bathroom, you're going to the bathroom outside in an outhouse. Not very pleasant if you've ever seen an outhouse or ever used an outhouse. Think of a porta potty, but a lot more disgusting. So this was what the shanty towns were like, and people called them Hoovervilles. Well, the Great Depression so far has been very, very depressing. We're going to stop the video here, but in case you're feeling really, really sad and depressed, I want to let you know that A new president is elected in 1933 named Franklin D. Roosevelt. And even though the Great Depression continued, in our next video, we will learn about a lot of programs and a lot of things that Franklin Roosevelt did to help people during the Great Depression. So our next video will be a little less dark than this one. Okay, that is all we are doing for today, and I will see you for our next Great Depression video. Have a great day.